All right, if you have your Bibles, we're in Daniel chapter number 5, where we left off last week. We're in Daniel chapter number 4, and we see the conclusion to the prideful heart of Nebuchadnezzar and how God reinstated him back into his kingdom. But it was not long thereafter he died of what we consider old age. And so then there becomes a succession. In Daniel chapter 5, we're going to pick up a quick succession of new kings to the throne. Nebuchadnezzar had the longest reign of the empire of Babylon, and that was 43 years. And then after that, it was just several quick successions of leaders until their ultimate demise. The history has such detail of the nation of Babylon and many of the nations that come after that. October 12th of 539 BC is when Babylon fell. And so when you go back and you read history and you go to museums around the world, they have so much of this information. They keep finding more and more information in archaeological digs. And it just confirms more of the information in the Bible, where many times they would mock the Bible because the Bible was just full of stories and fairy tales, and this stuff isn't true. There's no record of this anywhere. And over the years, and probably the last 100 years, so much more has been found that proves the story of the Bible. Now, we didn't need that as Christians who just believe, but it's nice when the archaeology backs up so much of the Christian or the biblical story, the biblical account. So, the time now is approximately 23 years later since chapter 4. So, as we go through the book of Daniel, see jumps in time segments, because you couldn't record it all in detail, but there's about a 23-year period jump ahead now from Daniel 4 to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel now is around 80 years old, and so he's getting up there in age, and so he's kind of been set to the back side of the kingdom a little bit. Even the current king, we'll see, has to recall who Daniel is, and so even though he is the head of all the magicians, the new kings come in and they just kind of push him out and don't really consult him much. And so, but he'll come back on the scene in a prominent way here once again. And so all this today, as we look at Daniel chapter 5, we'll see that the statue, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, that Daniel had to come and interpret, the gold, then the silver, then the brass and the iron and clay, all this represented different nations. And so we're going to see the culmination of the end of the empire nation, now the new nation stepping in to take over, which will be Mede and Persia. And so this is now fulfillment of the Gentile nations being in transitional time. And so this is another stage in this. And so we see once again what Daniel had seen in that vision and interpreted is coming true. And so here's a record of it coming true at this particular time of history. And so, with that being said, I'll give you the title of the message, and then we'll get into this. Some of you that know this portion of Scripture, there's a great feast, which our text will tell us. And so I title this message, "The Party is Over, and So is Your Kingdom." And that's exactly what's going to happen this time. And you've heard the old phrase, every party needs a pooper. That's why we invited you, party pooper. You haven't heard that? Okay. It's actually a song. I will not sing it for you, but anyways. No doubt that this was an interesting time, and what we'll see in this study is fascinating, just the events, but then the spiritual takeaway for us. Really, when you look at this, we have to understand this particular king, we'll see the succession of kings, their heart of pride and power-hungry people that wanted to assume positions of authority, but yet they use that power and their pride caused them to be blinded by what was truth and reality. And the same thing happens to us in our day and age. Pride is something that we all struggle with. It is something that we think more of ourselves than we ought to. But pride can dilute our senses. It can dilute us spiritually. And it could cause us actually to not see the impending doom that's coming. We sometimes will not see the consequences, or we're so full of pride that we don't care about the consequences. And that's exactly what we're going to see take place in this particular bit of history today. So let me just give you quickly the line of succession of kings to get to Belshazzar, because prior to this we have several different transitions of power from Nebuchadnezzar's death. And so after Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, we have his son takes over for 2 years. His name, catch this, Evil Merodach. And so the Eval or evil, it's given in the Bible a couple different ways, and history records his name different ways. Many of these kings had different names associated with their gods or particular timing, or sometimes it was a title associated with their particular position. So he reigned for 2 years after Nebuchadnezzar. He was assassinated by his brother-in-law. Nice family. It's what they did back then, I guess, to assume power. So Neriglissar is the one who took over, and he ruled for 4 years. And so he was part of the assassination against his brother-in-law. He was noted as taking charge of the prophet Jeremiah years before this. And underneath Nebuchadnezzar's rule, he was in charge of making sure Jeremiah the prophet was secured away. And that's in Jeremiah 39. You'll see that story there. He died, most believe, just of old age. So he was already up in age when he took over, and then he died of old age. His son, Labashai Marduk, again, these are names after their gods as well, son of Neriglissar, ruled for 2 months. He was just a boy. And he was beaten to death so that another could take the place of his throne. And this was set up, many believe, by loyalists to Belshazzar, not to be confused with Daniel's name, Belteshazzar. Belshazzar will be the king. Belteshazzar was Daniel's Babylonian name given to him. We've said this many times, but sometimes people get confused when they're very close in name. And so we see that what they believe is that Belshazzar sent in people who are loyal to him to take care of Labashai, kill him off so that he eventually would rule the throne quicker. But before he could get there, Nabonidus would rule, who married into the family. They believe he either married a daughter or one of the wives of Nebuchadnezzar, so he could then assume the throne. And so he does this, and his son, Nabonidus' son, is Belteshazzar. Now, Nabonidus is an interesting character. We call him the reluctant king. He ruled for 17 years, so next to Nebuchadnezzar, he ruled the longest, but he ruled from another location. And so in his absence, he made his son, Belteshazzar, the ruler. So he was a co-regent ruler of the kingdom of Babylon. Nabonidus, as he went to a place in Arabia called Haran, he was more concerned about his religious idolatry. He built an amazing temple to his God in Babylon proper, and then everywhere he would go, he would build more temples to his gods, and he was more involved with worship of gods than he was worried about the kingdom. He really didn't care about being an emperor of the kingdom, although by default he took on that particular role. So he kind of split the roles with his son Belteshazzar, who definitely desired that power in that influence. And so this is kind of what we'll see here where they talk about Daniel becoming the third ruler. Well, it would have been Nabonidus, Belshazzar, then Daniel. And so that'll come up later in our text here. So I'm just giving the background here so you understand they don't give you all that information here. History records it, and other parts of the Bible speak to these different men. You'll say, well, wait a minute, I thought Belshazzar was the king. Well, before he was, and then you had this king and this king and this king, and some other parts of the Bible name these other kings and what went on during that time. It can be confusing unless you really have a good grasp of history, and so hopefully I'm not muttering the waters anymore for you. And so Belshazzar then would be the last king of the empire of Babylon, and it is stated that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, is his father, but Nebuchadnezzar, in that time, they didn't have a term for grandfather. You would think, well, that's pretty easy. You know, he's not my father, he's my grandfather. Well, that's a more modern term. They just said he was a father to him. So you had to just figure out, well, what father in rank? First father, second father, third father, how far back do you go? So they in the Bible, they just say his father, which could mean that he was 3 generations from his father. So in this case, we know Belshazzar, father here, mentioned in Nebuchadnezzar, is his grandfather. And that's clear by just understanding of the family dynamic. So as we look to this, there are several things to note about the timing of this party that he's going to throw. So let's look at verse 1 of chapter 5, and we'll note here that there's going to be a grand feast thrown by Belshazzar, the king. And Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. So with that, let's just look here quickly. Several things to note about the timing of this party. It's one thing to throw a party when a birthday party. This past week we're blessed. I think I mentioned it Wednesday night, but we have the first girl in the family for over 50 years in the Ludka family. And so Sam and Justin had a little baby girl. We have a second one coming next month. It'll be another baby girl in our family. And so we have to figure out what to do with girls. I have no idea what to do with girls. But now we're going to have two girls back to back in the Ludka family, thanks to our beautiful daughter-in-laws. And so anyways, we have this wonderful blessing. But when we consider the timing of this party, when you see a birth, we get excited and we bring balloons and we bring different things. We have a birthday party, bring cake, and you have these feasts. When an anniversary party, you have all kinds of different parties to celebrate certain things. Here they're having a party, but honestly, when you understand what's going on outside the city gates, there was nothing to revel about. There was nothing to have a party for. And so part of this shows you how blinded Belshazzar was to his own pride and what his perceived thought was of their power to stay in charge. And so while this party is going on, prior to this, some historians say from possibly 2 months to 2 years, Medo-Persia is already on the advance. They're taking over different parts of the kingdom little by little. Outside of this city, there's already skirmishes going on between the Babylonian armies and the Medo-Persian armies. So we look then, why in the world would you have a party like this when you know outside of the city, far away, but outside of the city, there's war going on with your kingdom against other kingdoms. And so in one respect, they think they're so proud that they think we are indestructible. Nobody could breach our walls. Nobody could get in here. And so let the armies fight it out. Big deal. They just thought they were invincible. And so this is the pride of a young king who is full of himself. But they also didn't understand that the hand of God was moving and changing the dynamic of what was going on in the Gentile nations. And so Nabonidus, as I mentioned, who's the co-regent, he would have been the main king, but he moved away. He actually had to go to war with the Medes and Persians about 50 miles away in a place called Opis. And there he was defeated and he was taken captive. They didn't kill him, but they took him captive and he went into exile as a king of Babylon. And so Belshazzar is still back at the capital. He's back at the main place. He's throwing this big party. But I want you to understand why they might have been so proud. Because Babylon, not only the city, but then the actual fortified part of this city, was said to have occupied over 200,000 people. It was 15 miles square. So when you think of city walls, 15 miles by 15 miles by 15 miles by 15, that's a massive structure. Now, just to say that's one thing, but to understand this wasn't just walls about 8 feet tall, picket fence separating neighbors. These walls are said to be 100 feet to 300 feet tall. 87 feet wide. Now, if you go over to our gymnasium or basketball court, typically it's about 90 feet. So that to give you a reference how thick the walls were. So if you try to tunnel through, it's just going to be an impossible feat. You try to go over the top of it, 300 feet. They had every so many feet, I think it was every 100 feet or every 200 feet, they had another wall that went up. This is where the guard towers were, so they could pick off anybody with bows and arrows if they needed to. But it was just massive, massive walls. They had gates around that were all guarded and locked. Inside of that, they had another set of gates and walls that were not as substantial as that was, but still very difficult for any army to penetrate. On top of that, outside of the city gate, 30 feet wide moat, diverting the water from the Euphrates River around the property so nobody could just walk up and try to get over easily. Then they had the Euphrates River flowing through the entire 15 square mile campus as well, and they had iron gates to block those as well. So fascinating city, and they keep discovering more and more as they go and they do these archaeology digs. But with that being said, you can understand why perhaps Belshazzar just thought, nobody can get in here. It's impossible. Let's have a party. Let the warriors do their thing. Let's just enjoy our time together. And so that seems to be what's going on here. And so was it overconfidence, or was it absent-mindedness, or was it perhaps his pride? Because as I mentioned earlier, sin dilutes our mind. You may think in your pride, I can defend myself, or that'll never happen to me. And that's what sin does. It's a spiritual thing. It's not so much of a mental thing, although it has its effects on our mind. It's a hardness of heart towards the truth. Why do you think so many people today would say, I cannot believe in your God, I cannot believe that Jesus Christ was a man, came to this earth, died on the cross? And why millions and millions and millions of us say, that just makes sense. The Bible tells us very clearly the devil blinds the minds of those who won't believe. And there's pride associated also with our heart that, nope, that's too easy. Who gives that pride? Because according to the Bible in Romans chapter number 1, when man is born in the world, there's this innate knowledge that there is some being, there's something out there that is greater than us that has designed and made all this. And so we have to be educated out of that. And that's something that is just a sad fact of what goes on in the human condition. And so pride always leads to destruction. We know this based on what the Scriptures say. We know this just by looking around us. Just think about how many people that you know as Christians, or how many people that have been leaders in our time, in our country, or around the world, that because of pride they thought they were indestructible, and they rose in levels of power, whether it be small or great, and they thought they could get away with something. They thought, that'll never come back to haunt me. And it does. Pride dilutes the mind. It causes us to stand against the truth, and it causes us many times to make very poor decisions. And I think that's where we find this leader, the emperor, the king of Babylon, Belshazzar, exactly what takes place. All right, so this feast, verses 1 and 2. So he prepares a feast for 1,000 of these nobles, and they drank wine before the 1,000, meaning these people were getting wasted. I mean, it was a drunken fest. And history records some of the parties that they would throw, not just Belshazzar, but many of them. These were very immoral, perverse parties. And again, I hate to say let your mind wander, but it was as perverse as you can get. That's what was going on at these parties. And so they had the wine, they had the music. Here we notice in verse number 2, Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple that was at Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines might do what? Might drink out of them. And so what Nebuchadnezzar did, the former king, he took them after his third siege on Jerusalem. They finally wouldn't listen to him, so he said, fine, I'm going to take everything. And he took these items from the temple as trophies, and he put them in a museum to say, look, I conquered Jerusalem, even their God I have conquered. And he put them in a museum in Babylon. But Belshazzar takes it a step further, and so you can imagine they're at this party, they're getting drunk, they're having fun, they're doing all kinds of immoral behavior, and somebody says, hey, we've got the gods in the museum, their items that they use in their worship with it. Somebody go get the golden goblets and get the silver from there. Let's bring them in. Let's show them. And you just see this in their own pride and their own arrogance to say, let's just show everybody that, hey, there is no God above our God. And they bring them in and they start drinking. And God takes note. Just mark it down, Christian. There'll come a time where God will take note of what you're dealing with and what you're getting involved with, if it's sinful things. And the Bible tells very clearly, if He loves you, He will chasten you at some point. That guilty conscience you have, why don't you let the chastening of God stop there? Take it from someone who's had to learn the hard way. Listen to that voice of God. No matter what it is, just let the guilty conscience say, okay, God, I got to get this right with you. Why make God have to go further? And I, again, been at this a long time. I can just tell you how many times Christians get themselves in the most ridiculous and unnecessary situations because they, in their pride, just kept pushing, and not listening to God. Don't do that. We see here what God's going to do to a Gentile king, an unsaved man. But the Bible tells us that if He loves you, He's going to chasten you as well, just as a good parent will do to their children because you love them, you don't want them doing wrong. We've got to correct some attitudes or some actions. That's a loving parent. And so we must understand this. So this feast is taking place, and it was common in those days to host feasts, so common that the feasts sometimes were populated by 10 to 20,000 participants. So in respect, this is a kind of a small feast. This is really not as big, but there's records of different empires during that time, and the amount of animals that they killed for the kings at these feasts is just in the numbers of thousands just to prepare for these things. And they would bring in all their guests and nobles from other places and host these feasts and whatnot. And so, but we again need to understand about this feast. It was a very immoral, drunken, perverse party. I guess you could say it'd be like today, in the terminology we use today, going out clubbing and hooking up with people. but all in one place and going on in that kind of way. And we understand that that is immorality in our day and age, but there's nothing new under the sun, as the Scriptures tell us, and we understand that was exactly what was going on at this particular place. Perhaps he thought that his kingdom was invincible, or perhaps his perversion just made him so stupid and reckless that he didn't care. Have you ever been there, Christian? We just didn't care about the consequences? That's our pride. Mark it down, that's our pride. When we just don't care about consequences, that's you and your sin taking over and causing you or allowing you to think improper thoughts. The news of the Medes and the Persians advancing into the kingdom were known, but this did not stop the partying. They were still willing to go forward with the partying. The banquet hall that was located there at the big place was 173 feet long by 56 feet wide. Think about that. That's longer than our building is at its longest point. You'd have to go past our building from this outside wall to the edge of the parking lot, or to the what we call the Memorial Garden out there, to have the same length. 56 feet wide. That'd be a little wider than this auditorium is. That's how big this banquet hall is. You say, how do you know that? They excavated it. They actually have revealed this, and it was, again, Saddam Hussein who was renovating it. But before he could do anything in there, they had a lot of trouble trying to get that done. And that goes all the way back to the 70s and 80s when they were doing these things. One of the things interesting about this is when they were uncovering this particular site, the plaster walls were found. Because later on in our text, it's going to say that the handwriting was on a plaster wall, and that's exactly what they found when they were excavating this site. Isn't it cool how God's secrets have been buried for years, and it just proves the Bible true? When mockers of the Bible say, that stuff's crazy, we keep seeing more and more evidence come to light that proves the Bible. Again, we don't need that, but at the same time, it's just nice little exclamation point on the end there. And so we see that this feast was something that anyone with a rational mind would say, this is not the time to be having a party. But they were having a party. The second thing I want you to notice is verse 3 and 4 is the folly of this feast. I already mentioned it, but I want to give you a few illustrations for our day. This verse number 3, it says, and so they brought the gold vessels that were taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. The kings and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine, praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron, of wood and stone. And you can just imagine them getting inebriated to the point like, yeah, let's give a toast to the Almighty God. Let's give a toast to the God of the Israelites. Let's give a toast to this God and this God. And as this is going on, they don't realize what is happening outside of the city gates. The folly of them was they were not, because of their drunkenness, they were not preparing as they should. Drunkenness, as we know, leads to foolish actions. And you have to understand this. I've told you before, I don't drink. I understand the effects of alcohol from my own home life. I understand the effects of alcohol from dealing with so many people through the years that whether they become addicted or they just have an issue with it or it has caused more problems. Just listen to what's going on in our own society. 30 people die each day from drunk driving in the United States. 30 people a day die from drunk driving in the United States. 150,000 people die each year to alcohol-related illness. I have 2 uncles that died because of that. 3 million people a year die globally due to alcohol. You want a pandemic? There's your pandemic, but nobody will touch it. It makes too much money. Don't take away my fun. I'm not an abuser of this. Okay, I can tell you stories. Had a young man come to our church years ago. His dad was a Baptist deacon, kept beer in the fridge in the garage. Maybe once a month he would have a beer. What he did not know is that his son, who was in junior high, was going out there and replacing the beers that he was drinking and became an alcoholic in 7th grade. Don't tell me there's no danger in it. I know personally from what I did when I was a kid. Say, Pastor, I can tell you story after story after story. People say, Pastor, I was drunk, I didn't know what I was doing, and they're in jail right now. I can tell you so many stories. And he's like, why is it worth the risk to us who have senses and understanding and a mind? All right, get off your hobby horse. I want to protect people from making bad decisions. And if you don't know well enough, I want to protect you from making bad decisions. There's just certain things that aren't wise. Now, the sin is drunkenness. We get that. But why do something that might cause more problems? Sin dilutes alcohol, dilutes our senses, or we'll do things that if we weren't drunk, you wouldn't even try it. You wouldn't even think about it. But the basest things inside of us come out when our morals are loosed up. And we are willing to try things that we would never try, or willing to do sensual things that we say, I wouldn't do that. Just being honest with you. For every person who says they can handle it, 255 die every day. Just reality. That's where we are. That's just alcohol. We're not even getting into the other stuff. But what was going on at this folly? This was going on. They were so sauced, buzzed, you could use any terminology. Look, I grew up in it, I understand it all. We understand they got to the point where they lost connection with reality. And they were willing now to defy the holy God. So, well, I would never do that. Okay, pride. Pride. They mocked God, and God took note. Using the consecrated temple vessels that were meant for only one God, they sealed their own fate. And their fate was already coming, by the way. Belshazzar's folly came from his heart of pride. And the world's going to hell, but let's keep the partying going. And that's going on in our day and age today. The world's going to hell, but let's keep the party going. We don't want to interrupt people's fun. And so we see the folly. Then I want you to notice in verses 5 through 9, a foreboding sign. This foreboding sign. Foreboding has the idea of a heaviness. Something that's scary, something that's weighty. And sure enough, they're getting ready to see a very weighty sign take place. A miraculous thing that took place. A handwriting on the wall. Notice what it says here in verse number 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote, and then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loose. I'll explain that in a moment. And his knees smote one against the other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a gold chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then came in all the king's men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. And so here you have the scene. They're all partying, having it up, all kinds of immoralities going on. And all of a sudden, where the candle illuminated the wall, the plaster above the king's head, most likely, just a hand starts writing. You can imagine, okay, am I drunk? Am I really seeing this? Is this really going on? I mean, just think of all the thoughts you would have go through your head. But it was enough for the music to stop. It was enough for the people that were participating in all forms of immorality to stop. And you can imagine people say, hey, what in the world's going on? And finally the king shouts out, get the astrologers, get the Chaldeans, get the magicians in here. What is this? And the party came to a stop. And they're observing what's going on. And so they see this foreboding sign. To help you to understand verse number 6, there's kind of a humorous illustration that goes along with this. Lord Nelson was a British naval admiral, a captain during the French and Spanish War. And one day a sailor came running to Lord Nelson to report, Lord Nelson, a French ship has been spotted. Lord Nelson replied, sound the alarm and get my red waistcoat. They went out and took care of that threat. Another day, Lord Nelson was in his cabin, and again the same sailor came running to him. Lord Nelson, there's 2 French ships. Sound the alarm and get my red waistcoat. They went out and they destroyed the 2 French ships. Some time went by, and the sailor came to the captain and said to him, he says, Lord Nelson, why do you always ask for your red waistcoat? He said, good question, son. He says, I don't want to be out there and be wounded and have my blood be a distraction to the other soldiers. So I wear the red waistcoat so they're not distracted by that. So some time goes by, and the same sailor comes running in. Lord Nelson, Napoleon's whole fleet has been spotted. Sound the alarm and get my brown breeches, was the reply. Some of you, that'll sink in a little bit. Go back to verse 6. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other. And there's some debate over this, but I thought that was a humorous illustration to share with you. Here, the king's countenance, he went from that inebriated, red-faced look that hopefully some of you will never have to see or worry about, to probably pale white, flush, just trying to figure out what this is. The Bible is very accurate when it describes his knees started knocking and his loins were loose. So again, I don't want to go into too much description here, but it seems like he may have lost control of himself. Regardless whether that happened or the fact that he was just shaking in front of the whole king, these 1,000 nobles was enough to just say something bad is going on. And so this foreboding sign sent a message loud and clear that something wasn't right. Next, I want you to notice in verses 10 through 16, the forgotten prophet. Daniel, as many of you know, was taken captive in the early days of the Babylonian siege on Jerusalem. Now he's been in this kingdom. He's already had interactions with King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar rose him up in ranks because of his ability to interpret dreams. God set Daniel up in this kingdom. But now he's around 80 years old and maybe semi-retired, or just people don't consult him anymore. And so, of course, Belshazzar, being an ungodly man, brought in all the other wise men, leaving Daniel out. Seems to indicate that he was probably just kind of didn't think much about him anymore. Nor would he want to. Who wants to hear the truth when you're partying? How many times have you or I talking to fellow Christians and say, hey, I love you, brother, I love you, sister, but what you're doing is wrong. I don't want to hear it from you. Sometimes you wonder, and this is not every case, why people sometimes will leave our church. And sometimes because somebody very kindly, lovingly came to us and said, look, I love you enough to tell you the truth, but you're headed down a road of destruction. And sometimes they attend church less and less and less, and they finally just disappear. That's not every case. When you're saying that happens, and it's happened here many times. You reach out because you love people. You just know what's going to happen. As a pastor, a shepherd, you try to teach people the truth and just say, look, been there, done that. It's not worth it. Please reconsider how you're living your life. Keep it to yourself, pastor. Don't need to hear it. I've had everything said to me you can imagine. And I just say, look, I love you. You want to come back? Come back. I'll help you. We can do whatever, but it's not worth living your life to this. But it happens. The forgotten prophet, verses 10 through 16, starts off with someone who was not at the party coming into the party and saying, hey, you forgot about one key person. Notice in verse number 10. Now the queen, and they believe this is the queen mother of Belshazzar, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods, and I've made mention of this before, the word God or gods in the Hebrew is plural form, which to us is interesting as we talk about the Trinity. We'll get into that in our Wednesday night class here soon. But the holy gods, in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, who was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, or grandfather, the king, I say thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake, and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that the light and the understanding of an excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. That's the second time that's mentioned, the third ruler of the kingdom. Why the third ruler? Nabonidus, who's not there, co-regent, Belshazzar, Daniel. He would have been the third ruler of the kingdom if he could make known to them this vision. Now Daniel's response is awesome. And something you need about his response is what is lacking from his response. But it's interesting that before we get to that, we see this point of the forgotten prophet, the queen mother that comes in, who remembers Daniel and brings to attention to Belshazzar, who is just the party boy, say, hey, you realize you're leaving out one very important character here? The guy who's in charge, your grandfather put in charge of all the magicians because he could interpret dreams and he could do this. Somebody needs to go and fetch Daniel. So they probably went and fetched Daniel at a prayer meeting somewhere. Daniel's like, why are you bothering me? He's 80 years old now. He's lost his filter a little bit. He's probably a little irritated. They're having a party probably at nighttime. And he's like, really? The king wants to see me now? He had respect for Nebuchadnezzar after all he went through, and Nebuchadnezzar seemed to have a change of heart. But Belshazzar, he's like, I want no part of this guy. But he comes because he had to. And so we see, though, that the queen mother mentions things, as we just read here about Daniel. And I say this so you would take this to heart. The queen mother, who was a queen in a Gentile kingdom that was filled with immorality, but yet she saw the change in Nebuchadnezzar's heart. Maybe she had a change too about Daniel's God, because it seems like she's very interested in what she says about him rings true of his testimony. Now think about this. What's a good application for us there? What do people say about you at work? What do people say about you in your own family? What do people say about you in your own church? The places you go to play, recreation. Hey, teenagers, don't let yourself on the hook. Your sports teams, your schools, your interaction with your friends, the places you work. Now catch this. Your queen mother said, the Spirit of the Holy God is in him. Whew. Wouldn't that be nice if people knew that about us? When you interact with people out in the real world, there's something different about you. Most people would have lied or cheated, or they would have done this or that, and I can't put my finger on it. There's something different about you. Would that be great if somebody said, hey, I know what it is. There's a Spirit of the Holy God is inside of you. That'd be nice if we had that kind of testimony of those around us. Now, they might not call it that, but they might just say, you're just... Good happens when you're around. What's up with that? When there's problems and there's trials, you have wisdom that nobody else seems to have. Light, that means insight. Daniel would give great insight to things. Understanding, wisdom. And she went through this list of things. Wouldn't that be great that we as Christians, when we are out there in the real world, those are the things that people would notice about you? But listen, if you participate in what the world participated in that's immoral and ungodly, you'll never have that testimony with them. You just won't. So much better that you have that testimony. You say, oh yeah, but they're going to mock me. Been there, done that, been through it. But you know who they come to when they have real needs? They come to the foolish Christian. They come to the guy who won't party. They come to the girl that's just living a godly life. And they'll say, hey, could I ask you a couple questions? Could I meet you after work, or can we talk somewhere privately? I can't tell you how many times it's happened to me and people in our church because they demonstrated a love for God and they weren't ashamed of it. At times mocked, for sure. So we have the forgotten prophet, but then we have that fateful message. Daniel's going to reveal what this message is. And it's not a good message. It's a very difficult message to hear. But I want you to notice in Daniel's response, what he does not say is quite telling. I mentioned earlier, maybe his filter's gone, being 80 years old. Sometimes we talk about that with people. But I want you to notice in verse number 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself. Anybody need an interpreter for that? Keep your stupid gifts, king. Hey, Daniel, I don't want your gifts. Listen, folks, you have to know, you don't refuse gifts from the king. Not only that, but he didn't start off with the proper address. What did the queen mother come and say? O king, live forever. That was a common greeting to show, I'm on your side, king, even if you didn't meet it. He doesn't say that at all. He goes right into it. King, keep your gold. Keep your promotion. Keep your scarlet royal robe. Because I know what happens next, king. This kingdom's over. But he's just brutally honest. Listen, Christian, sometimes brutal honesty is necessary. You don't have to be mean about it. You just be honest. Then he goes into a little reminder. You know that the Bible oftentimes uses reminders again and again. Remember this? Remember when? He does it with the nation of Israel all the time. He has them remember something far back that God did to either punish or deliver the nation. And Daniel's going to do the same thing. So notice again in verse number 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself. Give thy rewards to another, yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known unto him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father. So here he goes back, giving him a little history lesson. He gave Nebuchadnezzar thy grandfather a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, languages trembled and feared before him. Skip down to verse 20 because it just goes into more detail there. But when his heart was lifted up, pride, and his mind hardened in pride. This is why I'm saying to you. How do you know if you have a prideful heart? When your mind is hardened towards the things of God. What God calls sin, we won't call sin. What God calls salvation, we won't call salvation. What God calls creation, we say, nope, it's got to be something else. When we harden our hearts towards what God says, that's pride. Even though we think, but I'm not a prideful person. Pride. But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, and he was deposed from his kingly throne and took his glory from him. How long was Nebuchadnezzar put out into the side of the palace there, out in some pasture somewhere? 7 years God made him like a madman and then restored him to the glory that he had. Many people believe that's when he changed his heart, changed his mind. And many people believe that they'll see him in heaven someday because it was a genuine change of heart. Could be. Verse 21. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like a beast's, and his dwelling was with the wild asses, and he fed in the grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled the kingdom of men, and he appointed over it whomsoever he will. Do you understand what Daniel's doing here? He said, I just want to know something about your grandfather. He had pride like you have. He went through a 7-year cycle. God restored him. But listen to what God wanted him to know. There's only one true high God. And he sets up and takes down whomever he will. He's reminding them of the purpose of the whole book of Daniel. God is a sovereign God. He's in charge of all the nations. And verse number 22, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou know all this. And he goes into explaining how he's lifted up his heart against him. Skip down to verse number 25, and this is the writing. Many, many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and to the Persians. And so we see here is that this handwriting that was on the wall, Daniel gives the interpretation of what it is. And notice, first of all, that word mene. And why they could not understand it, we don't really know, because what they're saying is this was in Aramaic, which they would have known that language, but for whatever reason, either their heart or mind was blocked. Some people say it was some type of code that was written on there, but regardless of what exactly it was, twice it says here, God has numbered you. God has numbered you. To get their attention, to help them understand. Tekel, you've been weighed. And the idea of the weighing here is that you have found with an imbalance. The weight you're using to give just weights are too light. You're taking advantage. And so he would say you've been weighed and God has shown that you are not adding up. And then Perez is a double meaning there. Perez means to divide, but it also means Persia. And so we see here is that this is an exact interpretation of what is going on right now at this time while the feast is going on. Catch this. The Medo-Persian armies are outside of the gates of the city. They're several miles north of the city of Babylon. They're diverting the waters of the Euphrates River into a retention pond of sorts. And the water that's flowing through the city gates, where it was impenetrable, it was moving so fast, so swift, they couldn't get in there. It was going lower and lower, and until it got down to the thigh of the army, they started going in. And they were to get the whole army moved through there to go into the city. And it says in some historical writings, people 3 days later still did not know the city was taken over. They went in right to the palace. They were able to capture immediately and by surprise take over the kingdom. How fascinating is that? And it's one of the most written about events in history, and it's something that our Bible records very clearly. And it wasn't just smart intelligence. God set this whole thing up, because here's another transition of power. Babylon's done. Medo-Persia is the next statue, next line in that statue, next kingdom in God's ultimate change in what's going on in world powers. Then notice the final proclamation, verse 29 through 31. The final proclamation, maybe at this point Belshazzar understands, he believes what is going on. Maybe at that time soldiers came in and said, hey, you need to understand, they're here. It's over, Belshazzar. They're here. We have no defenses. They got inside the city somehow. Maybe he looks at Daniel and says, Daniel, give him the scarlet robe, give him the gold necklace, give him the promotion. And Daniel's like, great. What a promotion. To go down with a kingdom that's just going to be overthrown. Verse 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of Chaldeans, slain. He was killed. And Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So a man named Darius, 62 years old, takes the kingdom for a very brief time. Cyrus is going to get credit for all this. And a fascinating story, if you want to read Isaiah 44 and 45, 160 years before this happened. 160 years before this happened. Daniel's now there in this transition of power, 80 years old. Cyrus comes. He comes with the scroll of Isaiah and says, hey, I want you to know something. Somebody wrote about you 160 years ago. And Isaiah 44 and 45 depict by name Cyrus coming in and taking over the kingdom of Babylon. Unbelievable stuff. We see how God was setting up this whole thing. Cyrus was so moved by that he gives permission and funds the Israelites to come from captivity back to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, to start the rebuilding. Check out Ezra. Then years later, 20 years later, Nehemiah. He funds it. He sends them back. Now, it wasn't without its obstacles, but that's how God set up the deliverance. It was at the 70-year mark that God said, I'm going to send you into captivity for 70 years of Babylon. All this was culminating at this time. Unbelievable stuff. Unbelievable, but believable, because it's our God. What's the application? What might be in your life today that has replaced proper worship of God? Because what pride ultimately does is we become our own gods. We find something else we're fixated on that takes away our heart from God. As clear as I can be. That could be money. That could be power. That could be fame. That could be sports. That could be whatever your money can buy. That could be a person. So many things can take the place of God in our life. And we just tip God. Yeah, I'll give God my time when I want to. And we have statements in the Scripture where God says, keep your offerings, keep your tithes, keep everything. You have no heart for me. I don't want your worship. Are you allowing other things to become your idols, like Belshazzar? Allowing pride to prevent you from seeing your own sin? God demonstrated His plan to the Gentile world and is still moving forward with this plan. We'll see more transitions of power as we go through the book of Daniel. But this was one of those fascinating stories that we can look to as God's in charge. And God is still in charge of all nations. And may I just say, even here in the United States, there are many people that think, United States, we will never be conquered. We are too strong. Listen, I'm a patriarch. I love my country. But I also understand that we don't see ourselves in Bible prophecy. I don't know what that means for us. I also understand that as proud as Belshazzar could be, it could be that not by war, but by financial issues or by agreements we make with other nations, something could happen to our own country where we have lost our position as a major world player. We just don't know. You say, why do you say that? Don't fret. God is in charge. He sets up kings. He takes down kings. Do what's right. Be honorable. Vote your conscience. Do everything you can. But don't fret. Let God be God. You and I don't decide who the kings are. Father, thank you for this time. And I thank you for the privilege of just sharing these truths. And even though we're looking at history from thousands